Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
You have these large platforms that control a large piece of the public deliberation, or at least the venue in which lots of public deliberation and sharing of information goes on. And this participation rate has climbed as people have lost confidence in mainstream media outlets, as in turn the mainstream media, or really the media environment in general, has disaggregated and decentralized and all the rest. So we're all left swimming in this sea of information, and what was hailed as wonderful, revolutionary, and the beginning of a new age of golden democracy when it helped elect Obama. This is a thing we said over and over again. Was then said to be a terrible thing, the greatest threat to democracy, et cetera, when it empowered Trump. And so I think thoughtful citizens need to consider seriously the extent to which large international companies who can throttle, control, manipulate the flow of information, especially in free republics or putatively free republics, where the free exchange of ideas and information ought to be the way that we deliberate together in public and figure out what to do in elections. This is one of the big questions of our time.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast from The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. And we've got a full crew today, kind of back from our summer travels, it feels like. We've got editor James Poulos, managing editor Seth Barron, and publisher and president Ryan Williams, and things are looking toward the fall, I would say. We're starting to kind of transition out of what is sometimes called the silly season, August, when silly things happen because there's nothing else to do. Not entirely true to form this August. There was kind of an eventful August, but nevertheless, of course, we were in a midterm year, and so things are starting to heat up. We're going to get to that a little bit later in the show, but we wanted to start with something we haven't been paying a ton of attention to that is nevertheless kind of gradually boiling like the proverbial pot with the frog in it. And that is the environmental regulation stuff that's been going on both here and in Europe, particularly, I would say, in Europe, or maybe that's just what has been coming across my newsfeed. I did want to read some of an extraordinary thread by Michael Schellenberger, who's really good on environmental stuff himself. The fist-pounding Republican. He's, in fact, a former environmental activist and now author of such books as Apocalypse Never, which we reviewed in CRB, Claremont Review Books. You can find sort of an assessment of his work there, but he's got a great Substack now, too, and he's good on Twitter. So here's just a little bit of this thread he's written. People think Europe depends on Russia for energy because it lacks its own. But 15 years ago, Europe exported more natural gas than Russia does today. Now, Russia exports 3 times more gas than Europe produces. Why? Because climate activists, partly funded by Russia, blocked fracking. He's got a graph to back this claim up, this 3x claim here. And he goes on, in 2014, NATO's Security General revealed Russia was funding climate activists, saying Russia engaged actively with so-called non-governmental organizations working against shale gas to maintain dependence on imported Russian gas. Nobody listened. Climate activists weren't the only ones to blame. BP acquired a 19.75% stake in Rosneft in 2013. Shell and ExxonMobil developed joint ventures with Gazprom and Rosneft. But the big Western oil and gas companies only did so because climate activists blocked fracking in Europe. He goes on. You can check out the thread for yourself, but I thought it was interesting in this age of Russian collusion and the accusation thereof that here's a major instance with serious repercussions right now that's really not being covered except by Schellenberger. That basically climate activists and their obsession with getting rid of the ugly, impure gases and things like fracking, which sound nasty and scary, have put Europe in an extremely dangerous position as Russia tightens its grip on the oil market in the era of those sanctions. Remember them that were supposed to cripple Russia's economy. So that is kind of one dimension of all of this. Over here, stateside, we have a similar kind of movement ramping up under the Biden administration and in blue states. California making its second attempt to ban gas vehicles. This is they tried back in 2004, I believe, or rather, excuse me, it was a 1990 plan that ended in 2004 or shortly thereafter. This time they're planning to end gas guzzlers, gas using, not even just gas guzzlers, but any car that uses gas by 2035 and to gradually phase this out. We'll see if it succeeds this time, but it's certainly a sign of the times and in lockstep with the Biden administration, who's making, the administration is making a big hullabaloo about this landmark legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, which is all about environmental justice. If you look on the fact sheet at whitehouse.gov, you can find all their claims about the money they're pouring into so-called renewables. Nowhere in this fact sheet does the word nuclear occur, which is kind of telling. That's something that Schellenberger is also frequently discussing, is the hypocrisy of these, highly inefficient and ineffective, but much more kind of optically appropriate, politically and optically successful so-called renewable energies, wind and solar and so forth, as opposed to the real solutions that people like Elon Musk and Schellenberger are famous for pushing. So there's a whole parcel of issues there, but kind of a piece with some of the other initiatives, White House initiatives we've been discussing. It's clear that there's a lot of, trade-off here between actual substance, America's true interests, economic and political, being sort of sold down the river for empty gestures and a form of religious purism, which is kind of difficult to wrap your head around unless you understand it as such. With that, I'm going to hand this over to the crew and start off with the question, these big gestures like we're banning cars, we're switching to electric vehicles by 2035 and so forth, have a high chance of not actually carrying off, not being followed through on, but they can do a lot of damage in the meantime. What do you guys forecast for the future of these initiatives, and how much hurt are we in for this winter?
Well, on the hurt side, you see a trickle of, kind of screen grabs and pictures of energy bills out of Europe, Western Europe, on Twitter and such. So we'll I don't know, who knows if this is all true and accelerating as quickly, but, energy bills quadrupling and quintupling, especially for small businesses. So I think that is definitely coming to the United States. I remember talking to, I was presenting to some foundation. We raise money from foundations as well as individuals. I'll say just on the west coast of California, and a few of the board members were kind of oil and gas types. This will be the left. If any of the left hears this, they'll go, "Oh, of course, oil and gas foundation types fund the Claremont Institute." But it's not, that connection to oil and gas is not as solid as it sounds, or conspiratorial. But they're, Midwest oil and gas guys. And they were saying, this was I think it was like last spring, probably. And they said they were bullish. They're conservatives, of course. They were bullish on the midterms because of the sad fact that they saw coming that energy bills were going to double, triple, or quadruple right sort of in fall, starting in this fall. So that I think that's coming. There are so many ironies and not weird things, but these plans will come, I think, especially a place like California, to naught. I mean, California would have to build quite a bit of nuclear power, I think, to sustain its plan for electrical vehicles. So they're moving forward with this plan. But this week, I think today or maybe yesterday, it's summer in California. It's hot. It's dry. We're in a severe drought. Mostly man-caused, but also the West experiencing actual drought as well. So it's even worse in California because we don't manage water well, and then we don't really plan well for actual droughts. So we're in a severe drought. So there's signs all over California that say water your lawn once a day. And what they mean is for like 10 minutes. A lot of people ignore this and just pay a little more for water, but that's the state of affairs out here. But the more important thing for electric vehicles is that the state of California we're asking EV drivers to not plug in this week, or to plug in as little as possible to avoid energy shortages, which always happen. Sometimes have rolling brownouts and stuff, planned outages in California in the summer because everyone's running their air conditioning. So I don't know where they think the energy grid is going to come to power all of this. It's certainly not going to come from wind and solar. We're not really doing much to bolster nuclear. I should say, Spencer, that in the Inflation Reduction Act, despite it not being on the fact sheet, they've put in production tax credits that are equivalent to solar and wind now for nuclear. So this is a way the Biden administration can say that they're, on the cutting edge of the energy production business. So there's at least that. At least now the subsidies are across the board, including for nuclear production. But I just don't see it. And then finally on the Russia thing. I mean, Russians are going to Russia, right? In a sense. So the old Soviet Union used to fund the left to its advantage in the West, and this latest example that you bring to us from Schellenberger just shows that while the ideology in the state apparatus may have changed a bit from Soviet times, they still know how to play us like a fiddle and to use the left against the West, and we continue to sail on naively. So I don't think any of this will end well, and I think its contradictoriness and unsustainability will be revealed in time. The question is, what will the left's response be to that fact? And if past is prologue, then they'll use it as an excuse to double down on more draconian, quasi-totalitarian, and counterproductive exercises of state power and coercive taxation and incentives and all the rest.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it makes, look, if they're actually going to start including nuclear subsidies in green energy, taxation policy, look, you can say it's hypocritical of them, but in the end, it makes perfect sense, and they should do it. Nuclear is green energy. It's the cleanest form of, I guess, renewable energy there is. It's cheap and it's effective. Germany was planning to close its last 3 nuclear plants by the end of the year, and now, I don't know. Apparently, they're kind of, the whole government is in crisis about this because they realize, from what I gather, there's this guy, Robert Bryce, who's very good on this. And he says, Europe is essentially entering deindustrialization at this point. Energy is that expensive. The cost of ammonia, the cost of natural gas have all tripled or quadrupled. They can't produce fertilizer. So, everything they said a while ago about food shortages, they may have been premature in predicting it for this summer, but it sounds like it's in the offing. Regarding the way, what we're doing domestically. I did hear this analysis once where somebody was saying, this guy Mark Mills was saying that the problem people make regarding energy is assuming that because in the digital revolution, we were able to, shrink the amount of space that information requires to be stored, so it doubles every 18 months or whatever. So now we can keep a gigabyte on like a tiny speck of silicon. There's this assumption that, energy should be able to scale that way too. So we should be able to, in some Jetson model, cram all the energy we need into something the size of a penny, and then just transport it, store it, whatever you need. But it just doesn't work that way. The energy that you can store in a barrel of oil is just so much more dense, long-lasting, cheap, and easy to move around than the equivalent for, say, electricity and batteries. He's got all these numbers. It's very interesting stuff. So, yeah, the whole dream, the whole green energy thing, and this is what they said back in 2000 when Al Gore was pushing this. It and at the time I thought, oh well, there's got to be some truth to it, but it really does just seem like it's a huge grift and this huge way to give money to selected insiders who have started, green energy companies. And, I mean, what was a key part of the Green New Deal? We're going to retrofit 100 million structures to be green. They're outlawing natural gas hookups in New York and California. So what's the idea? Well, then obviously you're going to have to pour more and more of all this money into completely new infrastructure, which is all going to be dominated by these, Al Gore type insiders or, his friends or whoever. And I think the end, sorry to be so long-winded on this, is like immiseration of the populace. I think that's the goal. Yes, very expensive energy. It's almost a return to the days of like fuel gathering, where in like nomadic villages or wherever, people have to spend like hours a day just gathering fuel. It'll be a good way to keep people busy. And meanwhile, I mean, if you see the new goals of the World Economic Forum's, like, the way they see it is like, well, ideally people will eat about 8 pounds of meat a year each. And airline travel ideally should be limited to like one short flight every 2 years or something. Now, obviously, this isn't going to count for Leo DiCaprio or John Kerry or like anybody who matters. But, for everybody else, I guess on our cards, it'll say like, oh, okay, you've only got enough credits for a 175-mile flight. So sorry, wait a couple of years and maybe you'll build up. This seems to be the future they want. I don't know why. I would think that they would want to have a more prosperous future where the middle class dream extends to everybody, but that's not the goal they have in mind.
Yeah, it's not the goal, and it's easy to get the impression that they're making all of these, concessions because there's been a determination that humanity itself is an unsustainable arrangement on this planet, and that humanity and technology have reached a sort of inflection point where choices have to be made that favor technology and disfavor humanity. Maybe it sounds pretty grim though. And I think the race is on. The current system is pretty clearly just crumbling in some ways because of like malfeasance and idiocy and whatever corruption. In other ways, for broader reasons, deindustrialization probably started somewhere in the 70s. It's not necessarily a bad thing. You go back and look at, sort of Victorian London coated in like 3 feet of soot at all times and, not great. And it certainly shouldn't be a scary or depressing prospect to think that we could kind of improve the way that we produce and consume energy. But on the other hand, these scrambles to set up a new system, the pieces don't really seem to fit together, and certainly not in time. I mean, it seems a little far-fetched at this point, even all things considered, to think that a social credit system that actually works is going to be effectively snapped into place. And I think that goes all the more so for infrastructure stuff. You have to like strain to remember that self-driving cars were supposed to kind of take over the streets by now, or even by 5 years ago. And it hasn't materialized. Companies are quietly giving up on it. People don't really want it. They had like curved TV screens a while back that was supposed to be the next big thing, and nobody wanted it, and it was quietly shelved. Google Glass was there are these supposed breakthroughs that kind of just the moment isn't right, or they actually aren't needed or wanted, and they sort of fade away. And if we can't, field a national fleet of self-driving electric cars, then what's the alternative going to be to people driving around gas-powered vehicles? Probably at this rate, considering the limited competencies of our regime, it's going to be like buses. It's going to be like old buses, public transportation in its most, almost primitive forms. And yet, horses, that's bad. Having your own farm on your own property, that's bad. Growing your own crops, raising your own livestock, that's bad. The parts that they're trying to fit into a whole here, I think, are not going to fit together functionally quickly enough for the current regime to be, I should say, the current sort of like socioeconomic arrangements to be wholesale replaced with the speed that I think they need to be in order for the regime to remain in power. There's still going to be large swaths of America where things basically work pretty well under the circumstances, where people still basically know how to do things, where they have enough money and strong enough family ties and enough skills and abilities to basically keep the wheels on the wagon of what could be recognizably normal American life. And it's very hard to beat that out of people, especially if you're scrambling to spin up, newfangled systems that don't quite work the way they need to. So despite all the grim indicators, I think that it's going to be very hard for these macro engineers and the policymakers and would-be, priestly class surrounding them to shut down the alternative sort of normie way of life. And that so we'll be able to see, laboratory of democracy or semi-democracy, as we might say. And Americans will be able to kind of see in real time what works and what doesn't. And, as people start running for the exits of a crumbling system, a lot of them will have choices, even if they have to take sort of their final carbon credit flight to a part of America where they can go on carrying on a recognizably American life.
Just one quick data point, again from Schellenberger, to illustrate my point about California's capacity. Of California's 30.4 million, roughly, motor vehicles, just 2%, that's 563,000, are electric. So using the state's own estimates, California will need 17 gigawatts of additional electricity to power all those electric cars. Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, which the state has tried to shut down, is 2.3 gigawatts. So there's a disparity here that I don't see any plans in the works to address.
Yeah, the only thing that I have to add to all of that is kind of to Seth's point. It's hard not to feel as if at a certain level the suffering is the point. I mean, certainly if you actually wanted to fix the underlying problems that James is addressing, the sort of structural concerns that we're up against in this brave new world, you would behave very differently than the Davos crowd and the Californias and the Biden administrations of the world. I can't remember who it was that said to me recently, I think it may have been Bill Fogley at CRB reporting somebody else's witticism that, there's a certain sense that the solution only works if people have to suffer for it, that like something like nuclear, which solves a lot of the problems without causing people discomfort and pain, is like inadequate and at some like aesthetic level for a lot of the extremists and the environmentalist side. And I think there's something psychologically very true about that. There is a real sense that like we're wrong and bad and should be ashamed for wanting to thrive and have material abundance on the earth. It's kind of like a weird, post-theist Puritan holdover, that there's something shameful and evil about prospering and doing well. And like, you should, say in suffering, we find redemption and all these things that are kind of like half truths. We do find redemption in suffering, but presumably not by inflicting it upon ourselves or upon others, like merely for the sake of it. And so I feel as if that's a major component of this part of the kind of non-religion that we're dealing with, like the fact that people have to sacrifice. And it is not only a major part of what recommends some of these procedures to the ruling class, but also part of what I think generates a lot of the support from people who have a kind of yearning for like to make some grand sacrifice. And if it's not going to be for God or for country, then it can be, for the earth or for the planet or purity or the whatever kind of big abstraction you've put in the place of God. Anyway, that's my... Yeah.
But Spencer, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say, like, it's a weird kind of Puritanism because its most devoted acolytes, they only want suffering for others. Like, I don't
Right.
get the feeling that they are planning to suffer at all. The people they want to suffer are like the deplorables with pickup trucks who grill and, eat too much meat and fly Spirit Air to go to Disney World or whatever. Like all this like needless what they see as needless, wasteful consumption, which has nothing sanctified about it.
Yeah, I mean, part of what's disgusting about that class is that they kind of like relish these basic pleasures, and that's like there's something very distasteful aesthetically.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I definitely think that for the Davos class, that's definitely, inflicting suffering on others is the name of the game. But I also think that like I'm composting. I'm in my Beverly Hills, walk up or whatever, and I'm composting like filthy, stinky remains of like food in my sink, and that makes me feel virtuous because it sucks, and it's like way less efficient and fun than actual waste disposal. Like I also think that there's something weirdly masochistic in that attitude.
Granted.
In any case, let us move on to the latest revelation in the kind of ongoing delayed release explosive story about Hunter Biden's laptop and Hunter Biden's business dealings with Ukrainian and Chinese magnates on Joe Rogan's podcast recently. Mark Zuckerberg. The story is being put forward as, he admitted, although as we'll get into, it's not quite an admission so much as just a reiteration of the fact that Facebook was in contact with the FBI around the time of the lead up to the election when the Hunter Biden laptop story dropped and was basically banned from Twitter. I mean, you couldn't even like DM it on Twitter, and on Facebook it was not banned but suppressed, which Zuckerberg was keen to stress, although he wouldn't come out with like an actual percentage of how many fewer people saw this story because of Facebook's actions. Zuckerberg said to Rogan, he said, the FBI told us there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the 2016 election. We have it on notice that basically there's about to be some kind of dump that's similar to that. So just be vigilant. So another kind of the specter of Russian interference here, as Ryan said, Russia gonna Russia. So, probably based on some real behavior on Russia's part, but also, of course, seriously damaging to public trust, whatever of it there is left in both Facebook and the FBI. The reassurance that the FBI offered was, to me, the most striking thing of all about this story. After Zuck went on Rogan, the FBI put out a statement. The FBI routinely notifies U.S. private sector entities, including social media providers, of potential threat information so that they can decide how to better defend against threats. I really love that. It's like, don't worry, we do it all the time. We're constantly in collusion with social media companies and other media outlets to tailor what Americans do and don't see. I also really love the phrase potential threat information. It's impossible because of the sort of ungrammatical nature of bureaucraties to tell whether it's information about potential threats or information that might pose a potential threat. If it's the latter, it's truly Orwellian, like threat information. What kind of a category is that? That's pretty remarkable. Yet more remarkable, and this is something that I heard about on Megyn Kelly's podcast, I'm sure, and she was making this point. This is not actually a revelation in the sense that this relationship between Facebook and the FBI and social media more generally in the FBI and, the Fourth Estate and the FBI was already the subject of testimony, Zuck's testimony in front of Senator Ron Johnson in 2020, October of 2020, kind of slipped under the radar back then, is now perhaps in a quieter news cycle, perhaps, in front of a more jaundiced public, is becoming, part of the national conversation. But of course, you can go back even further if you're James Poulos and say that none of this really counts as a revelation, since in point of fact, these companies, the major conglomerates of our digital regime, have been in collaboration and collusion with the information state forever. I mean, I'll let James speak to this more, but GPS and touchscreens and any number of other things in the kind of guns and butter mode have been developed with government approval, in many cases with government funding, and certainly Jen Psaki was making noises about the kinds of conversations that her administration, that Biden likes to have with social media companies to kind of do their bidding. So, I mean, we've been talking about the kind of parastate nature of these corporations on the show for a while now, but this is a really striking news moment for that. What do you guys make of this? Bombshell revelation or par for the course?
Stunned into silence.
You're just gonna. I mean, yeah, it is everything and nothing at once. No, it is par for the course, and the curtain will continue to open up, and the reality will continue to be revealed. I don't think that people are that shocked deep down. It's really just kind of further evidence of a moment where almost nobody knows what to do. I've been tweeting less and monitoring tweets more recently, and the prevailing sentiment that I see popping up in the feed is, ready to do something, don't know what to do, out of ideas. It's a very bizarre moment, and it does feel like kind of every power center is weak in one way or another, and that makes for a dangerous time, but also a time where, even as things accelerate in some ways, it sort of feels like moving through sludge in others. Maybe, as you suggested, this is partly due to the fact that it is the dog days of summer. Things may start kind of moving out of zombie mode as fall gets going. But I really can't think of a time when those in power seemed to have less of an idea of exactly what to do, other than rely on rhetoric and push ahead with something that they seem not to have sufficient control over. It's pretty scary, and I think the main advice is to not get confused and to put one foot in front of the other, and to a certain degree to watch and wait. Certainly not a counsel of checking out or letting yourself get bribed out of participating in this lurch toward the new dispensation. But I've seen folks IRL just kind of crack under this weird pressure of waiting for some other shoe to drop or not, and really doing damage to themselves professionally or personally. Don't let that be you. That is my counsel to all who have ears to listen.
You would hope at this point that the some of our libertarian friends who've said for ages that this question of big tech and its free exercise of free enterprise is somehow not a legitimate question of regulation or antitrust or superintendence by any political power at all. You'd think that they begin to see the problem with this. It's been a long theme of this podcast from our very beginning, in a way, whether it be about COVID or about anything else. I mean, and it's one of James's old themes, James's analogies, to call this phenomenon the transformation of what was once kind of a free-for-all, free internet, open discourse to those who went on it, to a series of walled gardens. And you have these large platforms that control a large piece of the public deliberation, or at least the venue in which lots of public deliberation and sharing of information goes on. And this participation rate has climbed as people have lost confidence in mainstream media outlets, as in turn the mainstream media, or really the media environment in general, has disaggregated and decentralized and all the rest. So we're all left swimming in this sea of information, and what was hailed as wonderful, revolutionary, and the beginning of a new age of golden democracy when it helped elect Obama. This is a thing we said over and over again, was then said to be a terrible thing, the greatest threat to democracy, et cetera, when it empowered Trump. And so I think thoughtful citizens need to consider seriously the extent to which large international companies who can throttle, control, manipulate the flow of information, especially in free republics or putatively free republics where the free exchange of ideas and information ought to be the way that we deliberate together in public and figure out what to do in elections. This is one of the big questions of our time. Does not speak of an easy solution, but this latest example, which as Spencer mentioned, was already out there, in fact, but just got reconfirmed, of the government sort of kind of putting a thumb half on the scales of a national election of great import. Shouldn't surprise anyone, and it should concern us all. The question is, this question gets bandied about a lot on online and in writing about this. To what extent are we sort of slipping and sliding our way to a kind of soft China-like information regulation system? And to what extent are we not? And if we are sliding towards it, how do we arrest that? And how do we turn back in better directions, while at the same time acknowledging that, liberty and the free flow of information is not cost-free. There's going to be cranks out there as well as good, solid information. And once you get in the business of flagging that officially through various avenues of soft or harder state power and manipulating it and saying what's right and what's wrong, you just can't do it. You've got to stay out of that business. So that's what we mean when we take on something like quote unquote big tech. For example, at our Center for the American Way of Life in Washington, one of the things that our friend Arthur Millick, who runs that center, is working on. This is why we work on it, because small R republicanism in America can't really survive unless we fix this problem, or at least you can't fix anything permanently. Perfect justice is impossible. We all know that, but at least bring it to some tolerable level of balance. And I would submit that we're not there. We're not currently balanced. We're in imbalance. And so the left, unfortunately, rather than try to understand this problem, and a good portion of the right for different reasons, either say it's not a problem or they sort of invert the problem and say that there's really nothing to see here. All that Zuckerberg was doing at the behest of the FBI was trying to make sure that disinformation from whatever source didn't affect a national election when it comes out after the fact, and when we're permitted to actually talk about these things truthfully, that, Hunter Biden's pretty corrupt, has been doing a bunch of shady stuff, and it probably would have affected the election, but that's okay. Candidates are open to all sorts of familial corruption charges in the light of day, and they should affect elections. What it really just shows is another one of our themes. What really the left is interested in is protecting, quote unquote, our democracy, which means the realm of issues that we would like you to talk about, and the different ways in which we think you ought to talk about them. And that's what a lot of Americans, both kind of instinctually, but also in more thorough ways, are rejecting and rebelling against, both at the elite level and down to grandma on Facebook thinking that this ain't right.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to just a quick point. I mean, it just seems weird to me that there was this moment, and it wasn't that long ago. I mean, even under Obama, when reporters maintained a pretense of being nonpartisan, and media generally, like obviously it wasn't true, but they would make efforts. And then at some point, I guess it was under Trump, it just switched, and I guess it's not going back. It's now just above board that, well, like, why would we want to report on Hunter Biden when that would help the other side? I mean, it used to be that, right, that they wouldn't necessarily report it. There were big stories that they would underreport. I mean, what was that group that used to put out the top 10 underreported stories of the year? And it would be things like, the CIA and crack or whatever, or like stories that were, or some chemical company had to pay out like all this money, whatever, like real kind of investigative reporting stories that just didn't make the news because of the interests. But now it's like huge stories about politicians that would have been like, front page are just like totally just blanked. And I don't know, it's very weird. I'm not sure they can ever salvage what they had, which was pretty thin to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of late stage effect, I think, of operating without dissenting voices in your newsrooms, right? It's like, even if your official stated policy is we cover both sides, we're impartial, and you think you can kind of do that without actual conservatives nearby you to check your biases or whatever. Eventually, your entire thought world just becomes defined by your political opinions and those of everybody around you. And you do what we are now watching them do, which is why they don't feel like they have to be neutral on Trump, is they define their opponents outside of political legitimacy, right? It's like they get to decide what's quote unquote political and what's just neutrality, which is why I think there's so much commentary now on the right about like how neutrality is fake. This idea that there's like people kind of setting the limits of what counts as just like fair and unbiased. And then some things are simply so far outside the remit of acceptable discourse that it's government by emergency. It's an emergency situation all the time. The mere existence of Donald Trump or people who vote for him. I mean, Karine Jean-Pierre just said, basically, the president believes there's a domestic threat to democracy, and it's the MAGA Republicans, which is a term that, he sort of wants to repurpose into some extremist slur, but just means people that vote for Trump, basically. I mean, "Make America Great Again" is the Trump slogan. So what are we to infer from that? It's that for the people you're talking about, Seth, I feel like not only are Republicans, not sort of in the immediate physical vicinity of their newsrooms, they're also just sort of not admissible into the range of possible, they're not part of both sides. They're like other entirely. And covering both sides means like, covering AOC and, the Democratic Socialists of America, but also covering some of the more moderate leftists who just want to sort of reform capitalism or whatever. Anyway, I mean, to me, in addition to everything that's been said, one thing that Ryan brought up that I think is important about this particular story, maybe why it's hitting home more than it did back when Zuckerberg talked about this in front of Congress, is that it gives a kind of concrete form and content to one of these big amorphous conglomerate bodies that we're always referring to. Big tech, right, is one of those things that you say, well, big tech is in the pocket of big government or whatever. And the immediate response is always, well, like, who are you talking about? And this is, I think, a very tangible little like snow globe instance of what we mean when we say those words. Like, here is a supposedly private entity with deep and historic ties to like government money, that the government is out here saying, the Jen Psaki is out here saying, we talk to Facebook about the stories that we think are outside of that remit of acceptable opinion, that are dangerous, that need to be suppressed. And then here's the head of that company saying, well, naturally, when the FBI comes to me and says, like, there's Russian disinformation out there, I go on alert. And what does he go on alert about? Like, there doesn't have to be some grand conspiracy. It's just like, he lives in that thought world where certain ideas are inherently sort of dangerous and outside the acceptable remit. And then no matter how true they may be, that's what's going to raise his antenna. And he doesn't have anybody around him who's going to be like, well, maybe you should also be concerned about X, Y, and Z. Or have you considered that, in fact, like, this is a serious, as Ryan was saying, this is something that the American people deserve to know. It's why it's a concrete illustration of why you don't get into this game, why defending these corporations as private companies is so inadequate and falls so far short of a meaningful kind of address to what is seriously a constitutional, small c constitutional threat to the culture of free speech, as well as to the concrete reality of free speech. It sounded like somebody was about to break in there because I'm about to go on to the next topic. So does somebody have something else to say? No.
No.
Okay, I made that up. It's like the phantom buzz. I recently learned, sidebar before we move on to our next topic, that in fact, sometimes your phone does vibrate without receiving a notification. So you're not crazy. The phantom buzzes do happen. I don't know if I'm the only one who like pulls his phone out of his jeans and only to discover.
No, we all do, Spencer.
Okay, phew, that's a relief. It makes me feel better. I'm not crazy. The FBI really is coming for you, and the and the phantom buzz is really happening in your jeans. Okay. Let's talk about the midterms. We've kind of touched upon some of the issues that we're going to raise here. We wanted just to take a lay of the land as we move into fall. Biden gave a speech on Tuesday, which I think signaled some of his approach to this, what he's going to be messaging about. So I'll read a portion from that in a second. But we should also contextualize this by saying it kind of comes right at a moment when, for at least a brief while, it looked as if, in special elections, Democrats were sort of outperforming what you might expect given the abysmal performance of the Biden administration and the similarly abysmal approval ratings that Biden has been suffering, down to 37.5% at one point, had been kind of ticking up, went up to 42.4%. As of this recording, when we were chatting off mic, Ryan informs me that they're now kind of slumping back down. But nevertheless, you've got some of the major like bread and butter issues that Republicans have been rightly hammering Biden on, like inflation, like gas prices, some of those kind of easing up, although not, it must be said, to an acceptable level, just to a kind of like hostage situation level. Well, I guess it's not as bad as before. Anyway, this is, there's been some muttering in the air on both sides, I think, of the pundit class that, maybe the red wave is losing force, losing steam. In the meantime, Biden says in his speech, related to our previous topic, you're either on the side of a mob or the side of the police. You can't be pro-law enforcement and pro-insurrection. You can't be a party of law and order and call the people who attacked the police on January 6th patriots. You can't do it. What are we teaching our children? It's just that simple. But now it's sickening to see the new attacks on the FBI, threatening the life of law enforcement agents and their families for simply carrying out the law and doing their job. This is related to something Seth said a couple weeks ago, that suddenly, like, WTF, the left loves major government organizations now, loves authoritarian power. But this, with the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, which I think is probably part of what he's referring to here, and just generally with the very justified concern and alarm that Americans are expressing about these kind of unaccountable government agencies seemingly being politicized under Merrick Garland, and the DOJ becoming kind of a partisan entity. This seems to be a position that he's now going to take, despite crime rates, despite like Los Angeles streets being shut down by gangs doing donuts in the road and raiding 7-Elevens en masse. Despite all of this, it's now going to be that Republicans are the anti-law and order party. As you can probably hear from the tone of my voice, I have a certain degree of skepticism about these grand sweeping assessments that people are making about the trajectory of this election. I think we're really very much in early days, and it's quite difficult to tell. It's sort of like you look at this little tick on the graph and you extrapolate out, well, if present trends continue, but the whole point about politics is present trends never continue. So I'm still in the kind of wait and see phase, but I wanted to ask you guys what you think. Major about face for poll trends, bad news for the Republicans, or just a kind of tick on the bump in the road as we gear up for midterms and start to orient ourselves toward the stances that each party will be taking?
Well, I would say that, it's still, there's still several months before the election. I guess 2 months, really. Oh, 3 months. 2 months?
2 months.
2 months. But for one thing, yes, even if gas prices are down somewhat from where they were, I wouldn't really get too excited about that if I were a Democrat, because food prices are not budged. And anyone who goes to the supermarket, which is basically everyone, can see with their eyes what's happening to food prices, which is totally bonkers. And I would find it very hard to believe that your average voter is going to just brush that off. Second, I don't know. It's weird that they're really pushing so hard on this ultra MAGA theme. Now, they do polling, obviously. So, I mean, it's either a question of this is like a huge issue for some people, the concern that that your average Republican voter is like a crypto fascist and a Nazi, or they just have nothing. They have nothing to run on, and they've squeezed everything they're going to get out of abortion. Though I don't know, and this is where they're at. Just like talking about January 6th and the FBI, something I've seen a lot lately is people say, oh, you say that the Democrats are pro-crime or are causing crime, but look, the highest murder rates are in Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, all these red states run by Republicans.
Yeah.
But of course, when state governors have very little to do with law enforcement, it's all what's happening in the very blue cities. If you drill down a little bit, that's what's driving all the murder. I don't know. I mean, I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, it's really quite something, and and you have to laugh. I mean, this is really unprecedented language coming out of a sitting president, regardless of party or who's getting the target painted on their backs. But this is a declining figure with a team that is of declining competence, and they are in charge of a declining nation. And the rhetoric, the quality of the rhetoric is declining apace. Where do you go from here? The shred of logic that I think can be teased out of these outrageous comments and their elevation to a theme, an overarching unifying theme, is that the strategy is to rebrand the Democrats as the Antifa party, to normalize Antifa, to make anti-fascism the new brand, and to run with that. And to use that as the excuse, which papers over all failures and sanctifies all figures and becomes a sort of unimpeachable term and a justification for anything that happens under its banner. That seems to be the logic. There's a certain twisted genius to it, but the one problem is it actually has to work. And if you look at the polls, and not just the polls, there are other indicators. I don't think it's going to go over with the American people as of right now. On the other hand, Barack Obama said a lot of stuff that didn't seem to materialize into real policy, at least not very aggressively during his 2 terms, but really gave younger voters on the left a serious case of sort of psycho-political frustration, probably intentionally, I think, built up a lot of that energy, left it unsatisfied, and kaboom, that ticking time bomb has gone off and continues to go off. And it sure feels like something similar is happening now, where the riots of 2020 are now kind of slipping into the memory hole. But the building resentment and anger and belief that revolutionary transformation on the scale of a refounding of America is the only thing that will, take the pain away. That is building, that is growing. And Joe Biden, no matter how insane and inflammatory his rhetoric becomes, is just not going to be the guy to lead that transformation. He's not going to be the guy to refound America as some kind of, post-republic ruled by a caste of people pure in their identity. It's going to be someone else. And there's going to be a lot of hunger on the left for that someone else to be under the age of, 70 or 60 or 50. And satisfying that rage is going to be a real challenge, regardless of who happens to be sitting in the captain's chair when that moment comes. So these folks are playing with fire in a pretty serious way, hopefully not a literal way. And I think that it's ultimately evidence not just of their sort of desperation or incompetence, but of their specific desperation to accelerate out of the current tailspin and into something else. They want to exit America as we've known it. I think probably the smarter ones think that they sort of screwed things up so badly that there's no alternative. And that's a hard sell to Americans, even Americans in a very bad mood. People are not as inclined to blame America as the big brains at the top of the Biden administration think. And even if they are, you can assign a lot of blame to America without making the leap to, and that's why we need to destroy America root and branch and rebuild it as something else entirely. So, I'm tempted to sort of wish them good luck and have a laugh in spite of the seriousness of it. But, people can't wake up every day in a state of crisis and panic. And there are powerful human urges that push even people who take these kinds of problems and challenges very seriously in the direction of learning to take the stress in stride and continue to go about the business of building and rebuilding the America that we've known, that is recognizable still in everyday life. So I think that's going to continue. And the two models are going to become ever more apparent, and may the best model win.
Some of that may be true. I think there's a much more mundane explanation for the audacious pivot. I don't necessarily think James disagrees with this. The audacious pivot about law and order from the Biden administration, as well as the demonization of what they call MAGA Republicans. I think it's just a very short-term desire to save themselves from what looked like, and maybe will continue to look like, serious headwinds in the midterm elections. And that is, how do we get out from under this problem that we've been saddled with? This is we, the Biden administration. We've been saddled with this problem of our radical left wing since 2020, basically saying the police are bad, evil, and racist. Now murder rates are up everywhere a year and a half later, and people can kind of see it. So what can we do? Well, we can see in front of us that it turns out Republicans are anti-law enforcement because they're not too concerned about January 6th, and they think that the FBI is bad. I don't think that will stick, but we'll see. And then the MAGA Republicans bit is I think it's just a play for independence. If you look at independent opinion, as far as we can measure it, it sort of has soured and been sour for some time on Trump, so to the extent that you can tie across the country Republicans to MAGA Republicans and thus to Trump more closely. That maybe their hope is that you can survive a midterm election without losing majority in the House because you sort of scare enough independents about the tendency and trajectory of Republican voters. We'll see if that works. I should have mentioned as well some of our friends, one friend in particular, who watches a lot of this stuff more closely and even at the state level and is a little more involved in campaigns, says that the Dobbs thing is having an effect in the suburbs, et cetera. And it's partly typical Republican flat-footedness. The Democrats have a narrative about that and a decision overturning Roe v. Wade. They're pushing it relentlessly. It's pretty easy. It's a nice morality tale, which is that Republicans have done the unprecedented thing. Republican judges have done the unprecedented thing. Trump judges have done the unprecedented thing, which is take away a right that people had. This never happens in modern America. This is bad. They're extremists, et cetera. And rather than have a unified or somewhat coordinated message across candidates and a party, the Republicans don't have one at all. So that's, I think, taking a toll. The question is, how enduring is that through the election? People made a big deal about the special election in New York as being in a kind of swing district. The Democrat prevailed handily, and they thought this was a harbinger of what's going to happen in the midterms. And Dobbs being a boon to Democrats, I remain ambivalent about all that. But what certainly doesn't help is this complete lack of messaging, discipline, and coordination and strategy on the right, which has been a huge problem on the right for years and years and years, and it's an advantage the Democrats have. So we shall see. we don't have, I mean, Seth said 2 months left, but really I think September will kind of lock all this in. It's rare that stuff changes a lot in October, especially when, to get back to one of our previous themes, it seems like October surprises are only allowed to favor Democrats, and to the extent that they might favor Republicans, they're squelched and memory hold. So that's the environment in which we're living. But I reserve the right to be surprised one way or the other by November's elections. We're in weird times. We're kind of in this rolling national political crisis. Both parties are vying within themselves about who's going to control the party. Voters don't know quite what to make of all of it. And neither party really is anywhere close to, it seems to me, a stable or durable majority garnering coalition or message or basket of policies. So I think we'll continue to lurch forward and gridlock and confusion until a statesman or two appear, which does sometimes happen.
Yeah, nobody's got this thing on lock, that's for sure. And I really, whatever else may or may not be premature, I very much think all the talk about how Dobbs is affecting electoral politics in the states is quite premature. James and I were sort of chatting about this recently off mic, and to me, it just seems as if we're taking a few data points and extrapolating from that the entire state of this issue for the rest of time. And that's premature. Although, of course, we, as you all point out, have less time than perhaps I am fondly imagining when I say that we're just ramping up. I guess the electoral season always feels like it goes on forever and ever, but in point of fact, when it really gets going, it kind of rockets to its conclusion. So we will be here for all of it. Don't go away. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. We're here every week talking about a new set of issues in the news. And with that, we're going to close out by making just a little, personal housekeeping announcement. And that is to congratulate very heartily from all of us here at the Roundtable and the Claremont Institute more generally, to congratulate our very own James Poulos on his recent engagement. As I say that, I can already hear the screams of dismay from our female listeners as their chances disappear forever into the void. But we're very happy for James and his new fiancée. Always nice to get some good news in these times. And with that, thank you for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at AmericanMind.org, Claremont.org, ClaremontReviewBooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. We've got a new issue of the CRB up at ClaremontReviewBooks.com, so lots of content to be pouring over there, including some stuff from Charles Kessler, our editor, on these Supreme Court decisions and the notion of quote-unquote rolling back rights. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. I already told you to subscribe if you haven't already. It helps us a lot when you let people know about the show as well. And it is not only a boon unto our numbers, but also a joy to read your 5-star reviews. So please leave us one if you haven't already, or at least if you have a sub 5-star opinion of this podcast, keep it to yourself. That's it. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.